I have discovered, after being here mainly all the time since 1999, you are a helping congregation. That's why Jeff is such a good communicator. That's why he's such a good preacher. You are a helping congregation. You are alert, you respond, and so on. And so I want you to help me this morning. First, by thinking of some giant in your life. Who do you consider right now to be a giant? I mean, someone that's tall. They can be slender. They can be robust. But I'm thinking of physically tall right now. And if you are, how many, say 12-year-old and below in here? Raise your hand, 12 and below. Okay, quite a few scattered around. It might be your dad. I remember thinking my dad was so big. He was 6 feet tall, not all that large. But I remember reaching up and holding my whole hand, just one finger of his, as we walked across our farm near Harwood, Missouri. He was my giant until then I got up in high school and started playing basketball at Walker High School, Vernon County, 100 miles south of here, around Nevada, Missouri. And on our high school team, they didn't grow us very big then. In our conference, the Richards High School team had a giant. He was 6'3". Wow. I see you guys walking around the halls here, 6'3" and more easily. But that was a giant in those days. Now, of course, you have Yao Ming, advertising for Sprint, plays with the Houston Rockets from China, 7'6" tall. That's a giant. Shaq O'Neal, of course, in the playoffs now. He's over 7, a lot of them over 7 now. But think of Yao Ming, 7'6" tall, and now add 2, not inches, 2 feet to that. And you've got our good friend Goliath up here. The Bible describes him in 1 Samuel 17 as that giant, probably 9 feet 6 inches tall. Some say 9 feet 9 inches tall. But you just put yourself on a basketball court, place yourself under the goal, and realize, however tall he was, his head is right there in the net. And if he gets up on his tiptoes, his head touches the rim. That's the giant Goliath. And probably the story of David and Goliath has been one of your favorites since Sunday school, Vacation Bible School, and so on. It's a great story, all described in 1 Samuel 17. We just sketch it out a little bit before us to get it in our minds right now. The army of Philistia is over on one hilltop. The army of Israel is on the other hilltop, and they are getting ready to go into the valley and fight. It's the way they fought in those days. The valley is there waiting for their blood in hand-to-hand combat. They would have swords, spears, javelins as their weapons. They would have some armor, shield, helmet, a bit for their protection, and that was just about it. The Philistines were the bad guys. They wore the black hats. They were the Taliban, the terrorists, the Iraqis, the Iranians. They were the enemy in those days for Israel. But in those days, Israel didn't have available to them cruise missiles, stealth bombers, smart bombs. No, they simply look at each other from hilltop to hilltop, much like the Civil War battles that we picture from our nation not too long ago. Combat was like that, very, very, very personal. The Philistines, though, had this mighty man of valor who came out every day and taunted the Israelites. Think of Bin Laden and his taunting, and the other terrorists taunting the other nations of the world today. That kind of a situation taking place. He wanted the Israelites to send an opponent against him, just one person, to come down into the valley with him, and it would be one-to-one, hand-to-hand combat, and whoever won in that battle would win the national issue as well. And so he taunted them, send someone to fight me. They had a big edge, this giant Goliath. And it seemed Israel had no champion that could come against him. His armor weighed 125 pounds, the Bible said. His spear was 15 pounds. He was a big, powerful man. And so day after day, for 40 days, he comes to the hilltop and down into the valley and taunts the Israelites, send someone to fight me. He had that Muhammad Ali complex, not probably float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, but I am the greatest, I am the greatest. And Israel had no one to send down his way. They were getting discouraged, disheartened. The morale was so low. You can compare it easily today. The morale was probably like what? The Kansas City Royals getting off to a 16-44 start. That's how low their morale was. And into that situation comes a little teenage boy named David. David was the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse, and 3 of Jesse's sons, the oldest, David's older brothers, 3 were in the army of Israel. They were there on that hilltop fighting, not really fighting, they were there fearing as everyone else was fearing. And David's father, Jesse, had sent him from keeping the sheep to go to the front and to see how the battle was going, and to set some special bread to take to the brothers, his sons. In any war, cookies from home have always been good. So he's bringing cookies from home. And the Bible also describes even he takes some special cheese to take to the commander of the unit so he'll have safe passage for sure. And his task is to go down to the front, see how things are going, and bring the report back to his father. They didn't have CNN. They didn't have Fox News. They didn't have embedded reporters. You had to send someone to find out how things were going. Well, David gets down to the front, and he hears the taunting of that giant. And lo and behold, he up and says he'll volunteer to go down into the valley against this giant. Well, Saul is reluctant to let this boy go against this giant, such uneven odds, but no one else is stepping forward. And after all, this boy is very convincing. For he has said, I keep the sheep of our family, and I have killed with my bare hands lions, bears, and the God who protects me from the paw of the bear and the teeth of the lion, that God will help me in the battle with Goliath as well. And so Saul gives in, I'm sure quite reluctantly. Tries to put, you remember his armor, King Saul's armor on David, and of course that's too big for David, and he throws it off, and he decides he will go, of course, just on his own. He picks up 5 smooth stones from the creek bed. He has his sling, and it's one of these slings, with a leather pouch. You sling it like this, let go of a string, and whew, it goes. It's not a slingshot where you have a V or a U, and you'll, not that. And here's where the story starts. Now, you got to get it pictured. Here is a 9'6" giant. His head is in the net under the basketball rim. And David comes out with a tall step ladder, and he has to climb up on it if he's going to shake his fist in Goliath's face. They're down in the valley, getting ready for battle, and here's how the Bible describes it. Then David took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, Goliath, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy, handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you have come at me with sticks?" The Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "Well, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack, David ran quickly. And if you didn't see those words following that, where do you think David would be running? Where would you be running if Goliath were approaching you? David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, drew it from the scabbard, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. Kind of gory, isn't it? But battles like that are gory. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. What made David victorious that day? Practice, practice, practice. You know, some gifted people have honed their skills to perform at higher levels than others, and under pressure, they are winners. Well, that's what David was that day, for sure. Practice, practice, practice. Think of a Joe Montana in football, a George Brett in baseball, a Michael Jordan in basketball, just another level. Practice, practice, practice. Or was it maybe foolish courage? You know, war has a way of calling forth foolish courage. From Bridie Murphy in World War II to Forrest Gump in Vietnam. People have done some unusual things in battle. The adrenaline is flowing. They throw caution to the wind, and ultimately the Medal of Honor is hung around them. Was it foolish courage, practice? Or was it nationalistic pride? You know, people a few years ago would douse their bodies and clothes with gasoline and set them on fire and kill themselves for their flag, for their nation, for their cause. And now, unfortunately, they've stepped that up a notch, or should we say down a notch, by becoming suicide bombers and strapping armament around themselves and going and killing others with themselves for their nation, for their flag, for their cause. Was it nationalistic pride? Practice, practice, practice? Foolish courage? Or was it, just the simple statement, I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty? Well, as you ponder this, Joy has a way of telling this story that I think you will appreciate.
Back in the West, when the day was young, before it settled down, there was many a feud that was wild and rude in many a frontier town. And one of the battles that raged out there where the feelings ran awful deep was whether the West would come out best raising cattle or raising sheep. The cattlemen said sheep ruined the land, ate everything in sight. The shepherds said, we'll fight till we're dead, 'cause we know we're in the right. For years the battle raged out there, fanned by the prairie wind, till the Lord took a hand in the ways of man and brought it to an end. Now Saul was reading the shepherd's gang, he owned the biggest spread. The sight of his sheep made the cattlemen weep, Lord, he owned 1,000 head. Well, the cattlemen had had enough, so they drew up a crafty plan. They'd hire a gun and let him run those shepherds off the land. So there they are now face to face, and as the story's told, what the shepherds saw across the draw, it made their blood run cold. Goliath was leading the cattlemen, a giant in the world of brutes. He stood 9'9", and I'm not lying, and that was without his boots. Goliath shouted, don't waste your time, don't send 1,000 men. Just send up one, and when we're done, whoever's standing wins. The challenge hung on the prairie air like smoke on a cloudy day. But not one man would take a stand. They all just crawled away. Among the men who rode with Saul was a kid who played guitar. When the sun went down, he would sit around and strum to the lonesome star. Well, no one gave that kid a thought when Goliath raised his cry. Yet that shepherd's son was the only one who wasn't scared to try. Now David was that feller's name, and he was bound to go. He looked at Saul and he said to them all, "There's a tale you ought to know. I once killed a lion and a bear with my hands. I don't rightly know how, but God helped me win when I needed him. So I reckon I'll trust him now." Saul offered to give him his horse and his gun. He'd have given him anything. But David said, "No, I'd rather go with just some stones and a sling." A boy with a stone to face a giant? Oh, Saul just shook his head. And the rest of the crew were sad 'cause they knew that kid would soon be dead. When Goliath made his stand that day, a hush fell on the crowd. And what he spied on the other side just made him laugh out loud. "Well, what's this thing here? A mangy pup? I thought you'd send a man." Though his heart was a-drumming, David kept a-comin', holding his sling in his hand. Now they all watched that giant and that boy as they played their deadly game. And there warn't a sound for miles around as they both took careful aim. Goliath was the first to make his move. He closed in for the kill. He curled his lip and he fired from his hip. But David was standing still. And then with a stone and the speed of light, David slung the sling round his head. With a mighty twist and the flick of a wrist, he struck Goliath dead. He fell to the ground with an awful roar, like thunder before the rain. The Lord had led, just as David had said, and Goliath lay on the plain. Now all the men cheered for the shepherd kid, and Saul was filled with pride. For now they knew what a man could do when the Lord was on his side. The moral of this story is, don't mind what others say, 'cause with faith in your soul, you know that your goal is only a stone's throw away.
Well, God is on your side because you are on God's side, and with faith in your soul, your goal is probably only a stone's throw away, realistically now. And by stone's throw, maybe in distance, maybe in time, but near. Be ready. You see, the moral of that story for us gathered here, June 11, 2006, Lee's Summit, Missouri, is that battles that we fight against giants of our day on various issues are probably going to happen just in the normal course of events, ordinary day-to-day life. Realistically now, David had no idea when he left Jesse in Bethlehem that morning that by that evening he would have fought and killed the giant Goliath. It just happened. It was a little bit of an extraordinary day because he was going to the front, but it was an ordinary event, and he ended up killing the giant. The story of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10. Jesus' story tells about a person who had no idea when he set out on the Jerusalem to Jericho road that morning that by that evening he would be the model, the mentor, the example of who is my neighbor. A person who would care and help, simply as a good-hearted soul. He saw a person that had been robbed and beaten, and he took the time and the energy and the resources to help that person. And he fought the giant of apathy. And he won that day, and he's now the Good Samaritan, our example of how to be a good neighbor. Rosa Parks had no idea back in 1955 when she stepped on that bus tired from a day's work in Alabama and ordered to go to the back and refused to go to the back of the bus, that she was taking her sling, loaded it, and shot at the giant of racism of her day. And she killed that giant along with the help of so many others. Sharon Watkins, employee of Enron, had no idea when she handed that memo to Ken Lay, August of 2001, that she was taking a sling and throwing a stone at the giant of avarice and greed. And yet she is the one that brought the giant down with that memo. In 1951, the University of San Francisco had an undefeated football team. Now, we don't know them especially for football, but they were back in those days. But in 1951, remember Rosa Parks was 1955. This is 1951. The Orange Bowl, to which they had been invited to go, this undefeated football team, the Orange Bowl, the Gator Bowl, and the Sugar Bowl, all played in the Deep South, had made a rule that they would ban any team that had black football players on it. San Francisco had 2 black players on their team. The coaches asked the team, do we go to the bowl game, the prestigious Orange Bowl game, undefeated, without our 2 players or not? How do you think they voted? Well, this year, 2006, 55 years later, in the graduation ceremonies at the University of San Francisco, 10 players still alive from that undefeated football team were given a standing ovation and were given honorary doctorates for the stand that they took back in 1951 that said, we'll not go. Without our teammates, we are a team. We are brothers. And they fought the giant of racism and really a cultural giant of those days, and they helped to bring it down. What I'm saying is that there will always be giants taunting, like bin Laden, like Goliath. The question is, will we as Christians who are supposed to get it right, will we fight the good fight? Will we keep the faith? Now here's the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say it. It's just a few pages earlier from 1 Samuel 17 that describes this battle. And it tells about how the armies were, the capabilities of the armies in those days. It's back in Judges 20:16. But before I read this verse, I want all the left-handed people here to raise your hand. Raise it high. You're going to be proud. Some of the right-handed people next to you will want to raise their hand next time. Left-handed people, keep your hand up, because here's what it says. Among all those soldiers, there were 700 chosen men who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Now, realistically, don't you think, if that's the capabilities of the armies in those days, that in that army of Israel, there were not some trained and skilled right or left-handed sling throwers who could sling a stone at a hare and not miss, and yet they refused to step forward and challenge Goliath, though they would not even have to get close to him. Realistically, they were probably there, but they didn't step forward. Their slings weren't loaded. We know in the story of the Good Samaritan that there were two who passed by on the other side, seen that person who had been beaten and robbed, and they were too busy. They were religious types, a priest and a Levite. They passed by on the other side. They were busy. They had meetings to go to. But it was the Good Samaritan who stopped and took the time. His sling was loaded. In Alabama, a lot of black people got on buses in those days, but Rosa Parks refused to step to the back of the bus. Her sling was loaded. Sharon Watkins, a lot of people at Enron knew the books were wrong, but she gave the memo that started things happening. She fought the giant and won. There are giants out here, friends, who will be taunting us in the ordinary activities, ordinary days. Racism is still with us. It shifts from group to group, color to color, race to race, and now almost religion to religion. Is your sling, let me say, load your sling for that opportunity in your social setting, in your business, in your company, wherever you are, that you might help in the wrong attitudes about race, the taunting of race in our day. Gender issues, there's still giants to be fought there on gender issues, sexuality issues, terrorism, poverty, health care. When I was a kid, all of us knew that polio was going to get us. We'd either be dead or we would be in an iron lung. We just knew it was killing our friends around us. And Jonas Salk loaded his sling and he shot that giant of polio, and now it's eradicated nearly over the entire world. Maybe you will be the one who will discover AIDS and the response to it, or malnutrition or starvation. You have your sling loaded when that opportunity comes to you in some extraordinary way in an ordinary day of your life. Your sling is loaded and ready. The Stevens ministers we saw coming here this morning before us, they've loaded their sling with a desire to help some giant that's hit someone else's life, and they need someone to walk with them. The second graders who got Bibles earlier, they're going to be looking at the Bible with loading their slings to live the right kind of life as they grow and develop. The graduates who will be here at the next service, loading their slings to do what is needed as Christian young people of Woods Chapel Baptist Church. What I'm saying is, in the normal course of events, you'll have the opportunity, if your sling is loaded, to be what God wants you and me to be. Just ask little David. Ask the Good Samaritan. Ask Rosa Parks. Ask Sharon Watkins. Ask the University of San Francisco football team. Just an ordinary event that became extraordinary. Keep your sling loaded. Carpe diem. Seize the moment. Seize the day. We pray.